Learning in Actions, Heal the Divide, Podinar series. Today, our focus is on how to use disruption to find your growth edge with our special guest, Charlene Li, who I'll give a proper introduction to in just a moment. I'm Allison Whitmire, President of Learning in Action, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sarah Bush today. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So what's a Podinar? This is your first time, Podinar is a cross between a podcast and a webinar. It's interview style like a podcast and interactive like a webinar. And we co-create this experience together. We love your questions. We ask you to register with a question, and those questions really form and shape the conversation we have. So thank you for asking your questions. And of course, as questions come up for you, we would love to hear them. So what are we going to be exploring today in my conversation with Charlene? We're going to be talking about what it means to be disruptive and why it's important for a leader to be willing to be disruptive. We'll talk about the 4 archetypes of disruptive leaders. And this is where our audience comes in, our community comes in. How does a coach work with a leader or an organization to actually be more disruptive? And then how can coaches actually be disruptive and anticipate their future customers' needs? Okay. And I'm so excited to jump into all of this with Charlene. So for the last 2 decades, Charlene has been helping people see the future. She's the author of 6 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Open Leadership, and the co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Groundswell. Her latest book is the bestseller, The Disruption Mindset. She founded Altimeter Group, an analyst firm that was acquired in 2015 by Profit, and she's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Business School. She's been named by Fast Company as one of the most creative people in business and an expert on digital transformation. But she's not going to be talking about digital transformation today. She's got a great TED Talk on that topic, if you want to check it out. She's today going to be talking about disruption. She believes we all need to stop talking about disruption and start doing it. With that, welcome, Charlene.
And I'm unmuted now. So thank you so much for having me here.
Oh, you bet. I'm really happy to have your voice in this kind of virtual room. So can you tell us what it means to be disruptive?
Sure. You know, disruption is one of those things where we have a very negative opinion of. We've been trained our entire lives to avoid disruption. The reality is, if we want to create change, we're going to be disrupted, and we're probably going to be disruptive too as well, because change that's worth doing is going to be hard. It's not going to be an easy way to do it. And so in so many ways, what it means to be disruptive is to challenge the status quo because you believe that there is a better future ahead. And you can articulate what that future is, galvanize people, create a movement to be able to come and join you to create that future. And you are creating this organization. Again, it could be a company, but it could be a community or even a society to make that change happen.
Yeah. You know, it seems to me, just from my own experience in a variety of work settings, that intuitively, the larger the organization, the harder it might be for a leader to be disruptive in it. Do you see that kind of correlation?
Yes, because the reason why disruption feels so awful is because it's taking apart the way that we see the world, the relationships in particular, and shifting those around. So in a small organization, the relationships, the networks, the influence, all that is locked down, it's easier to see and understand, and you can begin to manage those changing relationships in a fairly straightforward way. But in a large, complex organizations, you pull one of those threads and there's this ripple effect to the entire thing. So you may start over here, but somebody else over there in another department go, wait a minute, you can't do that. That impacts my life. I'm not ready to be disrupted. You go do your own thing, but don't let it impact me. And
Yeah.
so it starts locking down closer and closer. So if I look at disruption through the lens of relationships, in particular, how they're and especially how power is shifting in those relationships. This is why we fight it. We like the status quo because we know exactly where we sit. We know where power sits, and we know our relationship to power. In a disruptive time when things are changing and shifting and how those power relationships are reestablished, we're floating in the air. We don't know where we fit in. This is why that middle management, the permafrost, as some people call it, the frozen level, frozen middle, is so difficult because they are smack in the middle of these changing relationships throughout the organization. And they're like, until you tell me what's going on, I'm just going to stay right here where I am.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to move.
You know, I so appreciate you framing this in terms of like where the power lies in an organization. So the person who, the leader who is wanting to be and willing to be disruptive, how are they impacting the balance of power through their initiation of disruption?
Well, oftentimes it requires that they give up power or the perception of their power. I get asked oftentimes, I don't like the fact that employees and customers can speak back and give me negative feedback. It's very disconcerting. I don't want to hear the bad news, right? And for many of us, we've just, this has been the reality over the past 20 years. And people still fight it. We just don't want to see it because it upsets our notion of where we sit in the world and where the power lies. So if I ignore that and ignore the fact that any of that exists, I can sit inside my bubble and not have to change.
Yeah.
But the minute you acknowledge it's there, you're shifting power to them.
Well, just the gut thing that comes up for me, and you can spot me on my gut, is that I'm not sure millennials are going to let that happen. Like that's the first thought I have.
Right. And I think this is the expectations, especially now after this past year of the pandemic. We have literally been in each other's bedrooms. We have peered into each other's lives. Relationships we have now with our leaders and with each other is completely different. And to expect us to go put that back into the bottle, stuff it in, and go back to work 5 days a week in the office without a peep, you got to be kidding me. I've just discovered this other thing that works pretty well. We've proven that we can be successful in our businesses and proven that in some ways we are thriving in this new world. And now you want us to go back?
Yeah.
No way. I'm going to go look for another job. There's plenty of jobs out there.
Yeah.
So this is a time. This is going to be really hard for leaders to manage. And I think coaches need to be really aware how are we going to help them and support them, provide that scaffolding so that they can make this change and transition.
Yeah. Yeah. So first, I think we're getting some weird kind of like echoey, like feedback thing. At least that's what I'm hearing. And I think that's just the internet today. So I just want to say what I'm hearing. So we put a name on it, but I don't think there's anything we do about it right now. You gave a really cool example of shared power, a talk that I heard you give, and you can use any example, but you used the Red Robin example in the talk I heard you give. Will you share an example of this idea of shared power and how it relates to disruption?
Sure. With Robin, what happened was they put in a feedback bulletin board into the workplace. And so any employee, front lines, waitresses, servers, anybody at the front desk can put in there and say, hey, I see something interesting happening. And they had come out with this new pig out hamburger that in their testing in the labs looked pretty good, but in reality, it was a disaster. And the servers were commenting back like, this is a nightmare. People are sending it back. Nobody wants to eat this. And if they had just relied on the regular feedback loop, it would have been weeks until they saw this happening. Instead, it was days that they could see something was wrong. And so they immediately went back into the labs, literally cooked up a new recipe and had it back out to the front lines within weeks and within that one recipe and replace it completely. The speed at which they could do this was tremendous. But think about where the power just went. Instead of the all-knowing product development people in the inner sanctum of the company having all the power, now they're reliant on the front lines and frankly, the voice of the customers being conveyed through these frontline people. And imagine what the frontline workers felt like. It was a completely different way of seeing what their job and responsibilities were. They were the ones who were safeguarding, making sure that Red Robin was doing the right thing for the customers. And they had a voice that was never heard before. And that was enabled by technology, but also by their own agency. So
Yeah.
this is a big deal because you see that kind of power shifting, and we're seeing it across every industry where the top executives and the frontline people are beginning to connect and communicate. And we're seeing, instead of the call centers and the frontline people being at the bottom of the hierarchy, they're no longer at the top, they're at the center. And because they're the voice of that customer, the most immediate voice and the translation of that voice, they have now tremendous influence and therefore power within the organization.
So I think what I'm hearing, it's a connection I don't believe I really made before, is that what I'm hearing is that there's a direct connection between a company's ability to disrupt and its willingness to give up power from the top and push it toward the customer.
Well, if you think about it, when you have a hierarchical organization, it really served a purpose. Because 50 years ago, communications was very, very precious and very, very expensive. So you needed this hierarchy to make sure that the information was getting out to people throughout the organization. So decisions would filter down and information would filter up. But now information is freely available. I don't need the hierarchy to be able to understand what's happening. I can see it literally in real time. And so one of the major reasons why you have hierarchical structures has just gone away. Wow. And yet we still cling to it. We still act as if the hierarchies are required for us to have a large, complex organization. And in fact, they're holding you back because information and decisions flow very, very slowly. It's kind of like telephone. Remember those games when you play telephone and relays it to the other? It's just not accurate and it's not fast. And in a world that's constantly changing, you want this instantaneous real-time feedback and decision-making so that's very clear what's going on. So I find that organizations that are able to close that power distance, you may still have hierarchies and departments and things to really focus the work to talk about best practices. But the traditional reasons why we have hierarchies, we really have to say, what is the purpose of that hierarchy today? So is it to organize work? Is it to convey information? What ways to do that? That's a lot more tangible and focused on those customers. And frankly, a lot more fast moving to adjust to what the customers are saying they need.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that in order for an organization to be disruptive, it means they have to be willing to rethink how power is shared. They need different systems of communication and the flow of information. What besides those things can make disruption hard?
The hardest thing is acknowledging that change is needed, and pretty radical change, because most people say, oh, let's go innovate. No, we know we need to change, but let's innovate. And we're going to send these people off to go find the next great innovation that's going to save the company, move us to the next level. In the meantime, we're just going to keep doing things over here. You do that disruptive, yucky, messy work. We'll just keep things nice and clean and organized here. In the reality is they come back and they say like, hey, we got this great idea. And you're like, you're crazy. We can't do that. That's going to mess everything up. And so if your top priority is to keep things orderly, to keep things operating well, efficient, with few losses, little risk, highly predictable, it's going to be very difficult to imagine a future that's anything different than what it is today. And we all know the future looks very different than what it is today. And if you can't even see what that future looks like and understand what the changes you have to make today are, then you're never going to get there. And that is the biggest disconnect. If I have a beautifully well-functioning company, I have highly profitable, loyal, happy customers, why on earth would I mess that up? Why would I even that? That's a good thing going. And that is what the disruptive organizations do. They know that this today, no matter how wonderful it looks, is not going to last. So they're making the changes, making those tough moves, preparing themselves to go on this disruptive journey when they don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah. What's an example of someone who's organization who's doing this really well, an organization that doesn't have to be disrupting because they're doing fine and they are anyway?
Yeah, I mean, you can pick the usual suspects like Amazon and things like one of my Southern New Hampshire University, a private university, nonprofit in Southern New Hampshire. They have about 3,000 students who come in person on campus. And back in like 1985, but like really early on, they started playing with online learning because most of their candidates are for degrees, and these are certified accredited degrees from a university, tend to be adult learners. So not young people 18 to 22. They're people going through career change, coming back from the military, re-entering the workforce. And online just made a lot of sense because you could do it on an asynchronous basis on the weekends, in the evening. And they've grown that now to 150,000 students that they service. And they're the largest provider of online degrees, of 4-year and 2-year degrees in the world. Who gave them permission to do this? Like, why isn't it Harvard or MIT or Stanford, right? It's Southern New Hampshire University has cracked the code. And they did this because they were 100% focused on student outcomes. Everywhere you go inside the organization, there are sayings on the walls, signatures of people taking a pledge. Everything they do is oriented towards students. Even tell students, you shouldn't be going to school right now. We will not take your money because you're not ready. You're just going to fail. Here are things that we can do to support you so that you can come back next semester and be ready to take these courses and be successful in them. Nice. And that's a very different approach than most universities that are centered around faculty and research and teaching, or driving a profit by having students take as many credits as possible, regardless of what those outcomes are. Yeah. And so they've had to pivot very quickly, and especially with this pandemic, so well positioned, able to just continue as if it was the way they normally operated, because that's the way they did things, was online. Yeah. They've cracked the code on this decades ago before anyone else did. Yeah. Yeah. Love that story. So we're going to go to questions, any questions you have. And so be thinking about them. You can raise your hand now. I'm going to go, and I see your hand, Henry, and I'll go to it in just a minute. I want to ask a couple of the questions that were presented in advance. And one of our regulars, Bo Stubblefield-Tave, probably butchered your name, Bo. He says, can a middle manager in a large nonprofit company be an effective disruptor? Absolutely. I don't think you need to be a quote titled leader in a leader role. Anybody who has a mindset to create change is a leader. And the middle manager has to look around and say, what needs to change? What could we be doing differently to be more focused on our customers? So just within your team, how do you orient everybody and align everybody around that customer, and ideally where that customer is going, How do we make sure that everyone's focused on what our purpose, our mission, our strategy is going to be? And how do we get there even faster? You have a lot of power, no matter where you sit, to be able to make that happen within the constraints of what the organization already allows you to do. Mm-hmm. But for you to go out to the very edge of what those constraints are and be constantly pushing it. I mean, the title of this session is finding that growth edge. How do you know what that growth edge is unless you go push against it? Instead, what we do is we sit back into the middle, the places where we know we're safe, versus going out to that edge and taking a look, even just taking a look. Yeah. And what I have found is that we're so much better at this now, a year after one of the biggest disruptions we've ever faced in our society. we were pushed to the edge. In 3 days, we had to completely pivot our businesses, shut everything down, close up shop, and do things in a different way. Something we never thought would be possible. And here we are, we're doing it. So why don't we think that we're not capable of sustaining that kind of change?
Yeah.
We don't give ourselves enough credit.
Yeah.
That if there's a reason to do this, we can actually make it happen. So I say to the middle manager, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for permission? You're not going to get it.
Not going to get it.
You've got to go ask. You just got to go do this, right? You just, no one's going to say, oh yeah, go have permission to blow things up. Instead, how can I make things better? How can I hack things? I'm getting a little mischievous look in my eye for a reason. How can I hack things and do things better? What change can I create? Creating change, then you're a leader. If you're not creating change, then you're not a leader, you're a manager, and that's fine. But if you see something, you see an opportunity, it's up to you to say, how can I make that happen?
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, Henry, question?
Yeah, thank you, Charlene. I love this topic. I'm drawn to the disruptors in past and present. I guess my question was about, you just mentioned going to middle management and giving them sort of a push to be, a disruptor. But what about, giving opportunities to other people at lower than middle management? I'm actually thinking about a story I had heard, which will be very quick, but it was in one of the major toothpaste manufacturers. One of them was having a major drop in sales. And so they gathered all the senior management, or they had the packaging people, the flavoring people, the quality control people, everybody trying to figure out what is wrong. And they had this big meeting with the top people, hearing from all these top managers, department heads. Nobody had an idea. And in the meantime, there was a janitor in the room who was kind of emptying the donut plates and the coffee cups and things like that. And he just said, I have an idea. If you made the cap on the toothpaste a little bit wider, the hole there,
Yeah.
every time they squeeze their toothpaste that they like, they're using it up a little bit faster. And it's not unethical, because if you don't want to use that much, you control it. But the normal squeeze, when you're not thinking about it, puts out a little bit more.
Yeah.
And they all looked at him. Yeah. And apparently that turned it around. So I
think you might have answered your own question, Henry. But thank you for the Goodwill Hunting story. So let's turn it back over to Charlene. So how do you empower people at a lower level?
See, the thing is, what allowed that janitor to say something? He had this idea, but in many organizations, you're not even at the table. You're just passing through. You're not supposed to even be in the room. What gave him the confidence to say, hey, what about this? And also, what allowed the people in the room not to just shut him up immediately and allow him to speak? This is all about culture. How do you actually empower, and more than empower, give a sense of agency to every single person in the organization? They have a voice, that they can act like an owner, that their voice matters, that they're not going to get shot down, that there's no places for bad ideas, because every idea is potentially good ideas. So the only bad idea is one that's never shared. So how do you change that, right? How do you encourage people to disagree with each other? These are all really fundamental ideas about how your organization works. The culture is what we believe in, and then how do we behave because of those beliefs? That culture, that toothpaste, had a belief that the janitor, who's not even supposed to be in the room, can actually say something.
Great story.
That comes from probably the executives saying hello to the janitor by name every single day. They see them appreciating what that person had to bring. That person felt valued and embedded in the success of the company. Yeah. So they're going to raise their voice, but it starts from there.
Yeah.
And the reason I think this is so important is it's in a completely different area. If you talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, you've seen all the research that organizations with more women, with more diversity in the executive ranks on their board do better. It's not because you just put them on there and they do better. There's a fundamental shift that allows women and people who are different from the status quo to rise up and throughout the organization and be accepted. There's a mind shift in the values and the behaviors that is reflected then in the results. It's not the numbers. You don't get the results simply by just putting people into executive positions. Changing. It's about how do you actually start listening and doing a better job of creating agency, listening to your customers, really truly having equity and inclusion and frankly, fairness. Because when organizations are fair, they are excellent. And excellent organizations perform really, really well.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're going to come back to a DEI kind of question in just a moment. Charlene's got some really neat data on race and gender as it relates to disruption. Abby, do you want to share?
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, I posted this here. Charlene, I might have missed the connection you made. Did you say that the pandemic impacted the communication flow in the organization such that the higher senior management was more open to hearing from people at the bottom of the organization?
Yes, again, it's shifting in some places and not all places, but this is a really interesting statistic came up from Gallup in that the employee engagement scores were sky high. I mean, they were in the lower 30s and went up into 40%. They come down a little bit, but in the middle of the summer, after the George Floyd incident, after the pandemic, managers were taking the time to check in with people and ask a simple question: how are you doing? Like, no, truly, how are you doing? And the employee engagement went up because we know that the number one influencer of that is your immediate manager, your frontline manager right there. And they started taking the time to actually ask, how are you? And that goes a long way. And it's that listening, again, that relationship that was being strengthened that gave people the sense that, oh, you really want to hear from me. Not just about how I'm doing, but maybe about the business now too. It's forging a different type of relationship. And the pandemic has actually helped with that, because no matter how much we dislike these Zoom meetings, one of the biggest advantages is everyone's in a front row seat. You see everybody equally. You're not sitting closer in because you're higher up. Everyone is on the same kind of flat screen. And that gives you a level of access and also visibility. Who's on your team? I haven't heard from this person. What's going on with them? So there has to be that innate curiosity on the part of that leader to engage. But what we're finding is that there was a necessity that they engage, and pandemic forced them to do this sometimes for the very first time, to have these deeper conversations with their team members.
That's really interesting. I just want to add an anecdote, a meeting that I facilitated last week on this, where one leader said, when they used to have in-person town meetings, some of the people would not speak up in front of a large group of people. But when you have a Zoom meeting and you can type in chat, that they were more likely to participate.
Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
And we find that with online and digital too, because, and especially for people who may want to take more time to reflect, to listen, and then go and participate. Or you may be an introvert. And so the idea of speaking in front of hundreds of people is not your idea of like an activity you want to do. And you also just don't feel safe. You feel very vulnerable. In chat and Zoom, if you're using any of the things like Teams or SharePoint or Slack, where it's asynchronous, it's a different way of communicating and making connections and sharing and asking questions or posing solutions that doesn't require a meeting of 20 people where you have to butt in because only one single stream of conversation can happen at a time.
Yeah.
So the dynamics of that are because of digital in particular, but also because of the pandemic. This growing urgency on the part of employees has fundamentally changed the dialogue around what leadership looks like.
I'd love to go to these slides you have around race and gender around this topic.
Yeah, this is data that comes from the Lean In and McKinsey report from 2020, and they've been publishing this for years. And it shows what they tracked is the percentage of people who are at the front, on the first line managers, directors, VPs, et cetera, going up. And I took that data, instead of showing it as percentages, I showed it as an index, so that if you are indexing against your entry level positions, what does it look like at each level of the management? And you can see, I can't read the numbers here correctly, but for white men, they over-index at the very first level of first-line managers, frontline managers. White women and men of color are doing fairly well. They're just about equal to their representation. And you look at it's just abysmal, and it keeps going down to the point where you actually get all the way out to the C-suite. No wonder white men are doing really well. White women and men of color are still kind of holding their own, and women of color, nowhere to be seen. 0.17 of the index. So 17% of what they were at the entry level. So this shows the intersectionality of race and gender, and just two different ways that you could be diverse, intersecting, and the multiplicative effect of these two areas. And it's not a glass ceiling for women of color. It is a concrete ceiling that's squeezing you and keeping you at that front lines. So if it was fair, it was equitable, this would not be. This would look completely different. And this is the challenge. I think many leaders are asking me, like, what can we do about this? And how can we make our communities talk to disempowered, disenfranchised members of our community? How can we make a difference around this systemic social injustice? I go, look inside your own organizations. I guarantee you it's happening right now. Go run those numbers and you'll be astounded what they look like. We don't look at these numbers at the intersectional level. We look at race and we look at gender, we don't cross the two. And we don't look at all the other ways that discrimination and bias could be happening: socioeconomic, education. We look at physical abilities. We look at ageism even. So how do we start thinking about this to make it a more fair workplace is the key question. Because when you're fair, you're going to be able to pull in the best of every single person and not promote somebody because of their association or familiarity to the hiring manager and the promotional manager.
So can you speak to like how much more challenging it is to be disruptive when you're like the only one of you in the room?
Yeah, I talk about what it's like to be the only. And just a little bit of context, I grew up in Detroit. I don't look like somebody who'd be coming from Detroit. And I often was the only person of color, definitely the only Asian for miles around. First Asian that anybody had ever seen when I was growing up. And so just was different. I was an only just by simply being in the room and a disruptor. And so, because I disrupted everybody's perception of where things fit into the world. And so many times I've been the only woman, only Asian, only a person that looks different from everybody else. So I've gotten used to it. It's not fun, but oftentimes what I've been able to do is gather being the only and to use it to my advantage. I'm already different. I'm already the only. I already stick out. So why not raise my hand and stick out even more? But you do that only when you feel like you fit in, right? And this is why inclusion and belonging is so important. It's so that we can create that psychological safety so that you can raise your hand. We all have felt what it's like to be the only, to be the odd person out. Not a great feeling. And what we should be doing is trying to remove that feeling so that people can bring their best self. even if it's really challenging to people. I get the pushback. I mean, we don't want to talk about politics. We don't talk about race. These are just divisive issues, but they exist. And I think as leaders, we owe it to ourselves to acknowledge that these differences exist and to know that even when those differences exist, we can still coexist. We can still learn how to get along, to have that dialogue, to have these tough conversations and be okay with it. That's the sign of a great culture. When we can accept everybody as they are, even if I violently disagree with your point of view, I still accept you. I still can work side by side with you, and we can be okay with those differences.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the question of, how can coaches, help cultures shift? I want to come back to that in a moment. But before we do, I'd love to talk about your archetypes around disruptive leaders. Would you speak to this?
Sure. Yeah. I surveyed 1,000 leaders all around the world from 5 different countries: US, UK, Germany, France, China, and Brazil. And I'm sorry, not France, but Brazil and China too as well. And ask them, okay, identify themselves as leaders, and then ask them, how disruptive are you on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being you like the status quo, don't like to change, and 10 being you feel really confident about your ability to drive exponential change. That was the definition of being a disruptor. And they gave a score. And then I also asked them questions to understand what were the drivers behind that score that they had. And it came out with 2 of them. The first one was an openness to change mindset. So they saw change as a positive thing versus something that was negative and to be avoided. The second thing is they exhibited leadership behaviors that very specifically empowered and inspired people to create that change. And so I took those 2 into 2 by 2 and put them into a chart of these 4. And when you find people who are high in both of them, the realist optimists, I mean, they're about 25% of the population. And they're your disruptors. They're the ones who can see the opportunities, but they also have the ability to bring people along. They're not going to blow things up. They're realistic about what the changes are, and they can lay out that plan and bring people along with that. Agent provocateurs love to talk about change. They're not that organized. These are a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley. They like to step on stage, wave their hands and say, disrupt or die, and then they walk off the stage and nothing has changed. And then you have the steadfast managers who just, again, they just get things done. But that status quo, the vast majority of people are about, in this group, about 50%. And what they are really focused on is getting stuff done, but not necessarily moving too far out. It's interesting to pair the agent provocateurs with these steadfast managers because the 2 of them really play to each other's strengths. And then there's my favorite, the worried skeptics, who are just don't like change, but also just don't have that ability to bring people along. And they're usually the ones who sit in the back of the room, just go, bah humbug, nah, we don't want to go there. That's too risky. Like, why would we ever want to change that? They have a role to play too. Because if they can understand where you want to go, if they can buy into the vision of where you want to be, like this is a good place for us to be, but they just still may feel very reluctant about moving. Their discomfort level just isn't there. Ask them to help you put together all those risk mitigation plans because they can see everything that's going to go wrong. Okay, we need you to figure out what's going to go wrong because it's an uncertain road ahead. We don't know exactly how to get there. So please bring those things up, bring up those concerns. Those are valid on the little rug, but you have to be on the bus going on this journey. Because if you don't believe we should be going on this journey, then we have to have a different conversation. Should you be here? Is this the right place for you? Because if you don't believe in what we're trying to build, then we may have to ask you to leave. So the archetypes are really helpful because every organization has these. It doesn't matter if you're Google or if you're a bank. Every organization has this. And you can only go as fast as your slowest worried skeptic. Want to bring them along, they have to be on this journey with you. And everyone has a role to play in a disruption strategy.
So our primary audience of people who are here today and who will listen and watch afterwards are coaches and OD professionals who work with leaders and organizations to facilitate growth and change. So if someone in this audience coaches a worried skeptic, so how might a coach a worried skeptic?
Yeah, I keep going back to the fact that you have to be aligned with where your organization is going. And if you're not comfortable with where the organization is going, do you have a voice? Do you have a place to be able to see? How do you figure out, navigate your way to understand what the strategy is and to make your voice heard? But at some point, even if you don't completely 100% agree with it, maybe 80% or 20%, at some point, that strategy has been set. And then how are you going to play into that? Where is the place to have that dissent, to have those conversations, to have that conflict? And when is the time to say, okay, I'm on board now, and I'm going to work 100%, 125% to make sure this strategy works? Because I don't want it to come back to me and say, hey, we didn't succeed in the strategies. You didn't pull your weight. You sandbagged this. Instead, we want to say everybody did their best to make this happen, and it just didn't work because the idea was bad, not because we didn't pull our weight. And that mental set inside of an organ is absolutely crucial. How do we disagree at the right time? And then how do we commit at the appointed time?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because if you can't make that commitment, if you can't be 100% behind that, if you can't ensure that everybody in your team and everybody in the organization is going to agree to disagree and then to commit, then you're starting to have a breakdown in terms of that alignment. And that's not healthy in terms of your culture. So these are some fundamental beliefs about how we make decisions. How do we carry through? How do we disagree? And understand that people, because at some point it's going to be your decision that gets approved. And you're going to want to know that everybody else who disagree with you is now 100% behind you.
Mm-hmm.
That's really hard to forge. You know, we can say, yeah, we're going to disagree and commit, but how do you actually do that? And this is where the coaching is important. Just because you say, okay, everybody commit, how do you ensure that everyone is committed? How do you ensure that in your heart, you are 100% committed when you fundamentally disagree with something in the direction of something?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
a tough place to be.
You know, what's coming up for me as I listen to what you're saying is how important trust is in a culture. Can you speak to like what are the really necessary qualities of a culture and you know how people like who are on this with us today who help organizations facilitate change, how they can help a culture change?
Yeah, I mentioned it before that culture is made of beliefs and behaviors. That's all it is. Nuances behind that, but if you don't have the culture you want, examine your beliefs and examine your behaviors. What are the beliefs that are holding you back? What are the things you say to each other? So a common technique I do is to take a bunch of sticky notes, give them to everybody. You can do this virtually too as well. And say, write down the beliefs you think are holding you back. Is it the fact that we can't agree face to face? We have to ask for permission. We don't have budget, which is the most common thing. We don't have the technology. Or I'm just a fill in the blank role. I don't have any power to make anything change happen. What are these beliefs? And put them together. And then you say, what are the common things that people all say? We're all saying the same thing here. And you will always have commonalities. And then you look around the room and you go, are we going to continue saying this? Or are we going to commit today to not believing these things anymore? You all have said this, but you're the ones who are perpetuating this. So let's agree, we're not going to do those things anymore. And if we hear each other saying these things or acting, behaving in a way that reinforces these old beliefs, we're going to call each other on it. I said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We've got these new that we come up with to replace them with. And that's how you do change. That's how you change a culture. You identify the things that you want to do and you identify the new things that you want to do. It's important to identify the new things to replace it. And then you reinforce it over and over and over again. So many times you identify the things that are wrong. We can get a whole list, but then, okay, so what are we going to do instead? Everyone's going, I don't know. So it takes some time to figure out this other side of things, you know? It's like, okay, great. We don't like this, but what do we like instead?
Yeah.
And it's hard because they challenge these old beliefs. Really, really hard. But that's what it takes. And so as a coach, it goes back. I mean, you're being asked to create fundamental, deep-rooted, deep-seated change in people and in organizations. And that has to start with this honest conversation about what's really wrong here and what's really holding us back. And once they identify that, it just opens a huge conversation that happens. That's a lot of introspection happens, a lot of questioning about like, what am I doing to perpetuate this old belief? What are my behaviors? What's that signal sending? Even if I may not be intentionally saying this, the fact that I do this, what does it say?
Yeah. Yeah. A new organizational narrative. Yeah. New organizational beliefs. So let's open it up for questions. Let's start with what's in the chat box that maybe Sarah comments or questions.
Yeah, Lowell says, how does one go for disruption if you are too far from the leader's inherent culture?
Yeah, again, this is like, it's so funny because I even talk to CEOs of very large companies, medium-sized, all sorts of companies. And they go, I can't change the culture. I'm like, you're the CEO. Everybody else thinks they can't. And you're saying you can't. You're the CEO. Come on. And the reality is every single person can change culture. You change culture just by showing up and how you work. And so you could be at the very front lines and you can say, I'm going to change this. I'm going to ask for permission before I can act. I'm going to act and I'm going to check and make sure that I can go and do this, but I'm not going to wait for permission from way over here. I'm just going to start doing that, showing and demonstrate again within the constraints of what's allowable. I'm not going to break things and get the company in trouble, but I'm going to push to that very, very edge. I hear this all the time. I hear it from entry-level people, middle-level managers. I hear it from students. I hear it from people at the very top levels. I can't make change happen. And I call BS on that. Of course you can. You just haven't done it. So you may not feel comfortable. So what are the small little changes you can make that begin to build that confidence? And confidence comes from knowing that no matter what the outcome is going to be, you're going to be okay. So one person, after I had this little talk, with them and their group, went back and said she's very keen on sustainability. And she noticed that the company just had tons of styrofoam cups. And it just bothered her every time she went into the coffee room. And she realized the marketing department had a bunch of mugs that were just going unused from past promotional campaigns. So the marketing department said, hey, can I get those mugs and put them in here in the kitchen? And then she had to address the fact that how were the mugs going to get washed? And she built this system so that she replaced all the styrofoam cups in the entire company because of this change that she felt needed to happen. So again, that's a very small example, but she went on to say, like, what else can I change? And this started this entire way for her and everybody around her to feel, oh, I have agency in this. I don't have to wait for someone else to give me power. I always had the power. That is the beauty of agency. You give people a sense of agency. You don't empower them. And that's so much more powerful than empowering, because empowering says, I have to wait for power to be given to me. I have to have permission to do things. Yeah. Agency is so much more powerful, but so much more difficult to create.
Yeah, they have it innately. It's not something they have to request or ask for. Yeah, I love that. Sarah, what other comments or questions do we have?
No other questions, but some really great comments. Erica said it reminds her of the concept of from Atomic Habits, and sometimes the smallest actions can change the trajectory.
Love James Clear. He's a rock star. He's one of my favorites. So before we finish up here, Charlene, I'd love to speak particularly to your empathy map around customers. And I'd love to think about this. So in the context of our audience who are coaches and OD professionals. So we've talked before in this forum about, in the last year, the business of coaches and coaching has fallen off a good, 50% or more. Coaches are often the first to be let go and the last to be brought back. And so the opportunity in my mind that this creates for our community is like, how do we think, how do we disrupt? How do we think differently about our customers going forward? So anyway, I love this empathy map that you created as a way to think about future customers.
So this comes from design thinking, and the idea is that you put your future customer here, and instead of defining them by their job, the role, the demographics, you're going to define what are the feelings that they have. How are they feeling about the situation right now? What are they saying? What are they thinking? And what are they doing? Again, these are four very different things. And to step into their shoes and have empathy for their situation will enable you to actually create the services that you have from their perspective. So this is the biggest mistake I see anybody doing, but especially coaches. You're talking about your skills and capabilities rather than their problems. You're talking about the things that you can do versus how you can help. And in particular, help address their particular problems. And you use their words, their feelings, and they feel like they are known. The impact of having an empathy map is that they look at you, meet you for the first time, get referred to you, look at your website, and they feel like you're speaking to me. You understand me. Of course, I'm going to call you. And it's being that specific that they feel like they know they're known. They don't have to go through this whole process of educating. You already speak their language. You already know their pain points. You know the journey they've been on. It's a running start. It is by far the way that I do most of my work is that I use that design thinking approach, have that empathy, talk to the problems, write my research, write my books to the problem that people are having. I use that empathy map to really bring out all those elements to be able to stand in their shoes. And the result is inbound. It's all 100% inbound as a result.
The limiting belief I experience that coaches have around defining a future customer so clearly is that it will limit them, that it will define their target market too narrowly. And I'd just love for you to speak to that.
Yes, I'll give an example. I have as my target market, my persona, the person I built an empathy map on. Her name is Valerie. She's a woman of color. You can see my passion for this. She is a mid-level manager director at a financial services firm, working mom, 2 young kids, all the challenges of that. I'm speaking to her challenges. I'm articulating her feelings about what's going on, her thinking, her feelings, and what she's saying, articulating how she's able to be a disruptor outside of work, but not at work. And when I articulate her pain points, I'm not speaking just to her. I've gotten so many responses from people like, why are you limiting yourself to just women of color? And I go, I'm not. I'm focusing on their needs. And it's so visible and vibrant to me. It drives my passion to work for them. But I guarantee you, all these adjacent markets also have the similar types of needs, similar types of problems. And they see themselves in the work that I do and talk about. So when I talk about how I help, I'm not saying I only help women of color. I'm talking to the problems that they face, that any disruptor faces, that any person who has ever felt the only, that any organization struggles with meeting their particular needs. It can be the hardest part of this, and all the other ones are gravy in many ways. But the vast majority of my work is not with organizations that are dealing with that particular problem, but it is the thing that drives me. Mm-hmm. And I find that along the way, I pick up so many other things because I am so focused on those needs of Valerie.
I love that. So we're going to come to a close. Is there anything you'd like to say in summation as we start to wrap up?
I remember seeing this question about order and disruption. It's something I just wrote for a magazine. It'll come out in June. But I think the two are the same thing on the same coin. You actually have to put order in order for disruption to happen. And the idea is that the most disruptive organizations my research found were incredibly well run, lots of structure, a huge amount of process and policies and guidelines, but everything is geared towards change. They have order around change. And the other thing is they would be constantly changing order, adopting it. It doesn't become this stasis thing that just starts molding away because it hasn't been refreshed. So order and disruption, order and change need to go hand in hand. And to hold these two parts together in the same space is incredibly difficult for people to do because we've been taught again that order or change is the end all and be all. The opposite is not good. In actuality, it's a combination of the two that makes them both so incredibly powerful.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we're getting lots of great feedback on the content here today. So if you'd like to learn more about Charlene, you can contact her and see more about her in these places. And you know all about learning in action. Go out and buy Charlene's book, The Disruption Mindset, Why Some Organizations Transform, Why Others Fail. And or she's got courses. She's online now. This course is on Udemy, The Ultimate Disruption Playbook. If you're unsure, like where you can find, you can type in Charlene Li and Udemy and other places and find the courses that she has online, and you and your clients can learn more about how to disrupt. I want to share an example of how learning in action responded to the disruption of the pandemic. We had never had a completely online course. And I thought, oh gosh, the universe is going through so much fear. Like what do I know? How can I help? And I thought, well, I really just don't know enough to help. And then I started thinking, actually, I know a lot more than I thought I did about fear and how to move through fear. So we came up with a really quick donation only, on-demand course about how someone can move through fear. And if I think I came up with the content in a week, we had it online in maybe 2 or 3. So I just show that as an example that all of you can do this too. We can be, as coaches, we can be disruptive. We have a class on the neuroscience of we, if you like neuroscience and this idea of how do we stay connected. It's all about the embodiment of relationship from a neuroscience standpoint. That's an on-demand course. You can check it out, learninginaction.com/courses. So thank you so much, Charlene, for joining us. I so appreciate you and love the topic, and we got such great feedback. Thank you so much for you and the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.